between Russia, Ukraine and South Africa. Now, we spoke about the impact it's having on us as a country economically, but what about South Africa and Russia? Well, our country initially calling for mediation in Ukraine. Once Russia invaded, though, it called on the country to immediately withdraw its troops. But reports indicate the president wasn't entirely happy with that particular wording and stance. Now, South Africa and Russia, part of BRICS, of course. BRICS being Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. They also have a long camaraderie going back to the apartheid era. So, what does that relationship look like now? Let's hear from political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze. Prof. Kotze, good morning to you. It's always so good to have you on eNCA. I'm sure many people are very curious to get your thoughts. Russia, South Africa, Ramaphosas and Vladimir Putin. What's your views?
Well, at this stage, it seems like the relationship is not as well defined as what many people would like. There are obviously within South Africa different views about it. Those who come from the ANC's background, especially those in exile, have very strong emotions about the old Soviet Union, but the Russian Federation isn't anymore the Soviet Union. And I think this is one of the differences that many people don't understand anymore. The Russian Federation under President Putin has changed quite dramatically, also ideologically. And some South Africans are not used to the fact that they are more inward-looking now, more looking towards their own region and not at all very much involved in Africa. It's only the last, I would say, 4 years after the Russian-African summit in Sochi at the Black Sea that Russia started to reach out to the rest of Africa, not only North Africa, because they had traditional relations with countries like Algeria and Egypt and other northern African countries, where they are involved in energy provision, as well as the selling of military hardware. And then they become now militarily involved in countries like first Mozambique and now in West Africa, Mali and others, with their private military group called the Wagner Group. So in that sense, there is a long-standing relationship, but it isn't as intimate as it was before 1990.
What we do have, however, is a far more intimate relationship economically as well, though, because this is what, and Prof, you're quite right in mentioning the rest of Africa, but the rest of Africa is not part of BRICS. We are Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. At some point, do you imagine that economically our country, our president, is going to have to decide if he's on the side of the Western allies, i.e. the UK, the US and so on and so forth, or are we on the side economically of Russia, because right now we're in this economic bloc that we benefit from?
No, I don't think he's going to make that choice, or he has to make a choice like that. He's going to have close relationships with both, and that is the approach of the South African government. When we look at the economic relationship at the moment with the Russian Federation, it's not a very extensive one. It is actually in terms of investments in favor of South Africa. There's more South African companies in Russia that run than Russian companies in South Africa. And some of the prominent ones are, for example, Naspers, in the media field. Then the beer industry, they have investments in Russia, as well as the big heavy machinery company called Bell, which is very much involved, for example, in the mining sector. Now, that's one aspect where there is cooperation between South Africa and Russia, is in the mining sector, and especially the engineering aspect of it. Then, as you mentioned, also agriculture. There's actually South African farmers who are farming in the Russian Federation in areas that they are not very well sort of placed. So there is, at that level, there's certainly interaction. But when it comes to political, President Ramaphosa still wants to be part of the G20. He wants to be involved and be invited by the G7, as he has lately. And therefore keeps his options open in all directions and not necessarily leaning very heavily towards Russia. I must say that relationship during President Zuma's time was actually closer to the Russian government than what it is under President Ramaphosa.
Prof, let me ask you one last final brief question, if you don't mind. I know it's a tricky one to ask as a last question, but I want your thoughts before I say goodbye on this. Sanctions. Do you see a possibility in the future of South Africa either willingly or being pressured into placing sanctions on Russia?
No, South Africa won't implement sanctions out of their own will. Some of the sanctions that, for example, the US has implemented already indirectly affect South Africa, especially in the financial sector. And therefore, South African banks, for example, won't be able to trade or to become involved in transactions with Russian banks. So, but that becomes global sanctions. It affects all countries of the world, not specific countries like South Africa. And that applied, for example, to the sanctions against Iran, as well as the blockade or sanctions against Cuba for many years already. So it's an established principle that the US and the West is using in order to close the loopholes of sanctions in general.
Well, Professor, it's always so good to have you on. I always appreciate your time speaking to us here on the South African Morning. Political analyst, Professor Dirk Kotze.